Hi, this is a recording for Patient Client Management 5, and this recording will be on Quadrant System 2.0. So I'll first take you here in Moodle to the algorithm, which is very similar. You've actually seen something like this before in PathoPhys. So I have it up here as an image file. You can put it anywhere you like. You have a patient or a client, and the first question you're asking is whether or not they're stable. And by this, we pretty much mean medically stable, although I am very interested in modifying this for this to mean stability in a much more broadly defined way. So, but for now, I think to keep it easier, we're going to just stick with is stable is really reflective of medical stability. And if the patient is stable, then we proceed to whether there are participation restrictions or not. If they are not stable, then the question is, can stability be attained? If it cannot be obtained, then you need to consider options, and this might be an emergency medical situation. If stability can be obtained, then can it be sustained? And if it can't be sustained, then again, you need to consider options. If stability can be sustained, once attained, it can be sustained, then we're back to participation restrictions. So an example here might be you have a patient who just can't catch their breath, and they're bordering on the lower spectrum of oxygen saturation, and you wouldn't consider them stable. But with some breathing techniques and with some bronchopulmonary hygiene techniques and maybe even some postural positional bronchial drainage techniques, they can get rid of some mucus and improve their breathing. So now you've attained, and then you can assess whether they can sustain that. So immediately there's a return in improved breathing and better ventilation that leads to better respiration, that leads to better oxygenation. And then you wait a little while to see whether that stays. You might even listen to the lung sounds, see if they've become cleared. And through that process, you've decided that yes, they're sustaining this right now, so I can proceed with examining the participation restrictions. Now, if there are not participation restrictions, then the question is whether they're physically active. And if they are physically active, then is there anything that we can do in terms of prevention? If they are not physically active, or if they have participation restrictions, then we're questioning whether there are activity limitations. If there aren't activity limitations, then we consider possible reasons for these participation restrictions. Why can't they do these if there aren't any activity limitations? What else is happening? And these might be social factors. If they have activity limitations, then we have to ask whether they can attain the activity. So, and go back to your ICF model to sort of get an example of what the activities are. Maybe even the ICF browser is a helpful place to look at the activity codes. But they're basically functions. And if they can't attain activities, then we have to ask whether they're still stable after having tried. And if they are still stable, then we have to consider the cause of why they can't attain that activity. And then we have to consider whether that cause is reversible or not. So I've kind of combined determining the cause and determining whether it's reversible into kind of this one step down here. And if it's a reversible cause, then we've got quadrant A, and if it's not a reversible cause, we've got quadrant B, which I'll show you in a moment. If they can attain, but cannot, then you ask whether they can sustain the activity. And keep in mind, not all activities need to be sustained, but most do, and this is where our definition of endurance becomes important, because when you can't sustain an activity, we're basically saying they don't have the endurance for this activity. So there's whether you can walk, and then whether you can endure walking. If you can't walk, you need gait training. If you can walk, but you don't have the endurance to sustain walking, then you probably need something else, like conditioning of some kind, whether it be conditioning to improve your um, walking mechanics so that you're using less energy, whether it be conditioning to improve muscle strength so that muscles have a chance to use oxygen with the workload that's being placed on them during walking, or whether it's outright cardiorespiratory aerobic transport kind of adaptations that need to be had. Um, so if they can sustain, then you essentially identify a new activity or a higher workload and you go through the cycle. I mean, not infinitely. I mean, I know I have it written here as a potentially infinite loop, but um, all models are wrong. Some are useful. This may be a little bit useful. If they cannot sustain the activity, then you have to ask whether they're still stable, having tried that activity. And then if they are still stable, then we have what is the cause of this inability to sustain. And if it's a reversible reason, then we have quadrant C, and if it's irreversible, we have quadrant D. So let me jump to, let me see if this takes me, let me jump to the quadrant 2 table, which is where I have the quadrants. So here we have quadrant A, they cannot attain, and it's reversible. So this is a quadrant of strength, coordination, balance, motor control, skill, functional training. Others, I can't, you know, I made this one day, I didn't think of everything. You're considering the time dynamics and the magnitude of expected improvements when setting your goals, because this is reversible. So magnitude of expected improvements, if you expect a muscle that's not functioning to become functioning, then what's going to change with a functioning muscle? If they cannot attain, and it's not reversible, the primary cause is not reversible, then they need a new approach. They need a new way to move, they need a new task, function, activity to achieve the same goals. Maybe they need assistive devices, environmental modification, or something else. So in many ways, here you've got movement systems, and here you've got dynamic systems too. If a person cannot sustain, and it's reversible, now we're talking about aerobic conditioning, endurance training, targeted training of specific reasons. You know, maybe it's weak inspiratory muscles, weak peripheral muscles that could benefit from inspiratory training or neuromuscular E-stim, or maybe blood flow restriction training. There's a variety of approaches, but it's essentially therapeutic exercise, an exercise prescription. So you learned a lot about aerobic conditioning, endurance training in exercise prescription, and then in this course, this is where we're really going to cover topics like E-stim for people who have weakness that's leading to endurance problems, in inspiratory muscle training, and some blood flow restriction training. And again, you're considering the time dynamics and the magnitude of expected improvements. And this helps with goal setting, this helps with planning. Where should this person go? If they cannot sustain and it's not reversible, then we're talking about quadrant D. And again, we need a new movement approach, maybe something with greater efficiency, so they can take their current ability to transfer energy and create and do work at a lower level. They can do work at a lower level of energy so that their ability to process energy meets the need. They can meet that demand because of the smaller demand. So they might need a new task function approach that reduces workload. Assistive devices can be involved here, environmental modification. So in the decision between long-term use of a prosthetic versus a wheelchair, for example, it might be that the prosthetic is great for around the house, but they can't sustain the distances necessary for community ambulation with their prosthetic, and they need a wheelchair for when they leave the home. This is just an example of the kind of thinking that might happen when someone can't sustain, and we don't think that they have a reason that could be changed. It's not reversible. So that's the essence of the second set of quadrants that I alluded to in an earlier video. See you in class.